Okay, so welcome to this week's episode of the Path Less Chosen, the podcast showing the careers they don't teach you about in school. My name's Sol.
I'm Jamie.
And this week's guest is Tristan, head of Jozi Talent. He's the only licensed football and rugby agent, and he has spent a long career working in Nike, working with some of the biggest footballers and rugby players in the world, but transitioned into his own agency. Jamie, what can we expect from Tristan today?
Yeah, plenty coming from Tristan today. He's a good mate of mine. I know he's done some very cool stuff in his time, so he's going to share some pretty cool bits. My three key things that I'm very excited to hear about. Firstly, how he got himself into a position where he was sending Erling Haaland and Kylian Mbappe boots. Secondly, I want to find out about why it took him 10 years to make his side hustle his main hustle. And thirdly, I want to understand his message around why everything comes down to the relationships you have with other people.
Okay, that sounds unbelievable. Let's get him on. Okay, and just before we do get him on, we are trying to build our mailing list because it's much easier to communicate all things Path Less Chosen to you on that. So if you go into the link in our Instagram bio at the Path Less Chosen pod, then you can grab the link to our mailing list and we will send you all things Path Less Chosen plus a few extra fun bits. Okay, apologies for the interruption and let's get on with the episode.
Tristan, thanks so much for joining, mate. Really glad we managed to get you on. I think the question we want to start with is that someone listening to this might see the fact that you worked for Nike originally, you know, one of the biggest sports companies there is in the world. You had a real good gig with them over in Holland, working in their sports marketing department, and yet you then decided to up sticks, give it up, and go full-time down the agency route back in your homeland of South Africa. So talk us through why you did that.
Sure. Yeah, so I kind of need to go back for that because already when I was a teenager in high school, I kind of knew I wanted to stick in sport. I didn't have much talent on the field, so I knew it would be some sort of administrative role. And I thought what would be most suited to me would be a career as a sports agent or a sports lawyer. So then I went and after school I studied a business and law degree as my undergraduate. And then I went to a business school for 1 year. And then that kind of led me into Nike. Immediately after graduating from business school, I started working for Nike in the Netherlands. And, it wasn't really with the ambition to go there and climb the corporate ladder. It was to learn about sports marketing and more, how I can use those learnings in the agency business. The agency side was always a side hustle. And then I think because it started pretty much in my first year of studies. So after about 8 years of it being the side hustle, I decided, well, at some point I just need to go for it. And I just figured now was the best time.
I love that. And so interested to get into the side hustle. Of course, that gets the Path Less Chosen in us lit up. But just before we go into that, I think you said, I finished business school and went into Nike, which is not an easy thing to just move into one of the biggest and most recognized companies in the world. How did you get into that?
Yeah, so I think I made something like 25 applications. And wow. The feedback I got from HR was like, okay, well, we can see that you're very eager to join us, but we can't really work out in which area because you seem just keen to go for whatever. And I was just an eager student who figured, if there's all these roles, why not just apply for each? Not really thinking I'm doing myself harm by not having clear direction. And then I was pretty much unsuccessful with all those attempts. So I found another way, and luckily through the help of a South African woman who did some consulting work for Nike, she managed to put me in touch with a hiring manager at Nike, who was another amazing help in the journey. And it was basically down to those two women that gave me the opportunity. They set up some interviews and those went well. And I went in on a very random role, but I knew it was just my foot in the door. And then I'd have a couple months to find something more permanent. So yeah, it was completely random, but it set me up for the next 5 years or so.
What was the obsession with Nike versus Adidas or Puma? I don't know.
A good question. I don't really know. I guess it's the biggest brand in the world. It really is twice the size of Adidas, at least, in terms of market cap and that. Maybe not at the moment because Nike shares have been struggling. But I think when both businesses are at their strongest, Nike really is more of a global dominant brand. But yeah, I don't think it was such a conscious decision. I'm sure I also made applications to the likes of Puma and Adidas. I know Adidas have an amazing grad program, and I don't think Nike, to my knowledge, really does have something like that. So I was just going with like a shotgun approach on all these things, and Nike was the one that stuck because there was a connection there. So that's why it was Nike. Yeah.
Had you really set your sights on working in sports marketing and the sports industry world, and it was just a case of thinking that Nike were the best company in that space?
Yeah, I think so. I wanted to go into a role that was as close to the sport as possible without being really on the technical side. So I wasn't going to go and become a coach or something. I wanted to have some sort of business influence, given my studies and all of that and my strengths. And then I thought, okay, well, sports marketing is pretty close. It's almost, in a sense, like an agency within Nike, and often kind of operates in similar ways. So yeah, I guess that was the thinking there. I could take a lot of learnings from the brand side, the marketing strategies, etc., and take that into the agency world.
Yeah, I think that's such an important message, of the fact that you always kind of knew where you wanted to end up. You wanted to have your own business, you wanted to end up in the sports world, but you felt that actually it was worth going down the corporate route, even though it was the sports corporate route at the time, because you felt that this is where I'm going to get my foot in the door, and you're going to do 25 applications plus and do everything you could to get your foot in the door, just to have the learnings that you were going to make from working at a company like that. So I think then the next obvious question really is, when you were working within Nike and you had your foot in the door, what were those key learnings, and how do you think that then set you up to going on to do what you're doing now?
Sure. I mean, I think it would be quite tough to really articulate it, because probably a lot of them are just, kind of soft skills and more psychological things, that kind of shape your mindset. But a big one was a network. Being in such a strong company, I had a position of strength to, build out my contacts in that. And yeah, I'd say, just the day-to-day things of, tools, learning how seek, sign, and serve is, the crux of sports marketing. Yeah, I think there's the technical side, and then there's the more kind of art and soft skills. And I think it just shaped, for me in a big way, having a worldview. I was this South African kid who hadn't really had much overseas experience, and being at Nike, especially, it was the European headquarters, so you have nationalities from every corner of the globe, and that really helped me, in terms of having to engage with people from all sorts of countries. So yeah, I think I couldn't even summarize the amount of learnings, but those would be the obvious ones.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's something that I always find, trying to explain to people who aren't in the sports industry, some of the stuff that's actually involved. We say things like soft skills, we say things like networking, but a lot of people would say that in a lot of different industries. But there is just that real niche way of doing it within the sports industry. So I think for anyone listening that's maybe thinking, do they go down the corporate route in sport like you have with Nike, or whether they go on their own kind of venture, without having to push you with all the secrets of Nike and stuff, what is the kind of mindset that you discovered there that people have that makes them successful as a brand within sport, and then as individuals within sport as well?
Sure. Tough questions, yeah. Look, I think Nike has a very strong brand identity, and within, as an employee, there's these maxims that you live by. So it's like serving athletes, create the future of sport. So I think a lot of those things are paramount to the mindset of people internally. And I think, that just kind of sets the tone for a lot of other things. At Nike, I can only really speak mainly in terms of sports marketing and how it relates to what I'm doing now. But I think it was always just, we are, at least from a footballing sense, we like the strongest footballing brand. And in order to stay there, strategies such as fewer, bigger, better, leading really with the best, the Haalands, the Mbappes, and then the rest will fall into place. Yeah, it's having that huge ambition to go for the very best athletes, and that will obviously speak loads for the brand.
100%. I can see it must be such a cool company to work for. So what is it that you were actually doing when you were at Nike? What was your day-to-day role? And also, it'd be good if you could shed some light on the kind of roles that Nike offer for people.
So I was in, I think, 5 or 6 different roles. The first one was in technology operations for 3 months. completely random. Then I got a 1-year internship in the football operations team. And then after that, I had the opportunity to stay in sports marketing, but it wasn't on a full-time contract. So I decided it would be better to move to another area of the business, but have that security. So I moved to the retail side, and I was marketplace operations lead for all the Nike-owned stores in Europe. Did that for a couple of years, and then found my way back to sports marketing, where I really wanted to be. And that role was as digital specialist. So basically operating the supply of product on the websites specifically made for athletes, clubs and federations. And then that was only like 9 months. And then I went back to the role that I started with in sports marketing, which was football specialist. But then I kind of, customized the role to suit my passion a little bit by incorporating rugby into the picture. Yeah. Because at the time, Nike they had signed the Springboks, but it wasn't like public knowledge. So I saw that as a big opportunity to kind of set myself apart. And already before then, Nike was sponsoring pretty much half the backline of the Springboks. Wow. So obviously that was a big passion for me. So yeah, I took that on. And then the role was to ensure the supply of boots, purely boots, to all the rugby and football players in Europe, Middle East and Africa. So it gave me great exposure in terms of seasonal launches, but then also specific events. So I was the lead for the FIFA World Cup in Qatar. I was also the lead for the Rugby World Cup last year, which was really cool. And then had also been involved in AFCONs and Women's World Cups. So yeah, it was, at times I had to almost pinch myself, sending boots to Mbappe and Haaland, knowing that when I watch a Champions League game, I played a part in that. It was really cool. It was at times like a bit surreal. So yeah, it was an amazing experience. I think the second part of your question was, what kind of roles are there at Nike? Sure, I remember even being there after a few years, it's still so complicated. They have a matrix structure as an organization. So you almost on a daily basis, you discover like another area of the business. And I mean, it's just so wide ranging. There's obviously the retail side, there's logistics, there's marketing, there's some roles that we don't even know about.
Yeah.
You find out some guys operating the Nike archives, just telling stories about the history of Nike. So yeah, it's really cool, and you don't almost realize how big an organization it is until you start to discover more and more of them.
I think that's fascinating, and I know a lot of people would have looked at that and they'd have stopped there. They'd have been working in like a dream job at Nike. They'd have been like, I'm not going to do anything else. This is perfect for me for the rest of my career. But I guess during all of that time, you were having the exposure, you were learning the network, you were learning the skills. But in the background, Jozi Talent was born like quite early on, right? So talk to us about, when did Jozi Talent start out and how did that work? And then what did it kind of evolve into while you were still at Nike? And then now that you've gone full time into it, talk us through that evolution over the last 10 years.
So the ambition was always that Jozi Talent would be an international sports agency. That was always the kind of end game, and specifically focusing on signing the best African talent and securing opportunities for them overseas. But we obviously couldn't start at that. So it started in 2015, pretty much off the back of organizing tours of South African teams, youth teams, in international tournaments, which we still do. So we represent the likes of Dynasty and Iber and Gothia Cup in South Africa and organize the participation of youth teams in those tournaments. And then it molded on from there. The next kind of phase was the coaching department, which my brother leads. He spent a couple of years in Germany and is a UEFA qualified coach. So he set up our coaching division. We've got three centers in Joburg. And yeah, he basically trains kids from under 6 to under 19. And then, now it's me leading the agency side as FIFA and SORO licensed agent. And yeah, basically, striving towards that long-term end game. So yeah, it's taken almost 10 years to get to this point.
Wow.
But I guess, yeah, we all had to go on our natural paths and learn skills and get qualifications, so that we are in a good position now to go after that goal.
I love that. And Tristan, as someone who found out what they liked doing and quit their job within 8 months, I'm very impressed that you managed to last the whole of the 10 years that you were at Nike. So tell us a bit, because I'm sure there's people listening who are going, I have something that I love doing, I have a side hustle that I love. How do I build that up on the side of a job that keeps the bills coming in and the rent, and that keeps, paying rent? How do I do that on the side of that job?
Yeah, it was often difficult because it could be seen as wearing two hats and serving my own best interests at times, and I think it also depended on different personalities that I met. Some people received it really well and loved the idea that, I had something else going, and they thought, okay, well, that's really cool. We're supportive. And then at other times it could be seen as there's a conflict of interest here. So it was difficult, but I, always just tried to keep the two things separate, which I think to a large extent I did, because, at the end of the day, I wasn't gonna, even if I was acting in my best interest, it would be bizarre to think that as an agent I could be signing the kind of players that Nike had signed. I wasn't gonna now sign Haaland and Mbappe. So there was a separation, I guess, because Nike is this huge global brand, and there was this pipsqueak who was just starting out. So it was difficult, but yeah, I think just time in the market allowed me to juggle the different responsibilities, and I guess I just made the most out of evenings, out of weekends, and I guess working smart and playing the long game. I think there's no exact formula for it. You just kind of go along and you see, and probably a lot of people would say I still resigned too early. And I might even say that in a year's time or so. But at some point I said, I have to give this a go, because if I'm not going to do it now, then I'll never do it.
And that actually leads me very nicely into my next question. Talk us through the last 6 months, a year. What was it that eventually drew you to the conclusion that now was the time for you to go, and whether you do regret it now or you might regret it into the future? It'd be interesting to hear how that process worked and why you decided now was the time.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the timing, I knew the Rugby World Cup was on the horizon, and I was going to play quite a big role in that. And so I thought that would be a good time to depart. Little did I know that South Africa were actually going to win it. So it got even sweeter.
Don't need to rub
Yeah,
it
literally, my last day in the office, I think, was the day before I went to the final. So it was all just really fitting and a nice close to that chapter.
Amazing.
And, I had obviously pondered the idea for a long time before I even shared it with anyone else. And in my mind, I just thought, I thought of this quote where it's like, in life you get to choose your regrets. And I figured if I don't go for it, I might regret it in 10 years' time and, be sitting in the same role, or, even if I've moved on, I might look back and be like, well, I had the opportunity to take that risk and I didn't. And I thought, if I look at the flip side, am I going to regret going for it? And I figured there's no chance, because, at the worst case, I've got that experience behind me, and I can back myself to, go and get another job, So yeah, it was met with a lot of uncertainty from family and friends, saying, well, you're working at Nike, living in Amsterdam, you've got a good thing going, just stick with it. And I just figured, well, I can always go back and if everything fails, then there will always be something else to fall back on.
Yeah. No, I love that quote, and definitely it's kind of the time where you've done that experience, you feel like you've got and learn all the most important skills, that now is actually the time to go and test it by yourself, right? So then what happens next? Did you go into the agency having already had some clients? Did you know there was going to be stable income, or was it a big risk and a big leap of faith really, where you had to go into and start pretty much your own journey from scratch, even though the agency had been going for nearly 10 years?
Yeah, look, so we already had some players that we were working with, but in terms of like established professionals, we didn't have anyone signed. So there was no sure thing because there was zero income, and still to this day, it's like a year on, and it's not like there's a steady income. I mean, you'll know this business as good as anyone that it's all about making deals. So it's very high risk. We managed, we've kind of over the last year managed to sign a few established professionals who have got decent experience in the Premier League here in South Africa. And then recently we've also taken the approach to try and, filter the players who we do sign, because initially it was kind of like a shotgun approach, in taking anyone who we can convince to sign with us. Now I feel like we're on a better pathway in terms of our strategy, but still signing high potential youth players. So I'll let you know in a couple of years if they are paying dividends.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we'll have to get you on a couple of years once they're playing for South Africa and come over to Europe, which hopefully we can help you with. But no, I think it's such an interesting insight because a lot of people, again, it's that thing where you took the leap of faith out of a really decent job of a massive company just because this was what you wanted to do ultimately, even though it was a big risk financially. And I think you've touched on the financial points then, but every time like we kind of touch base, I know you mentioned that there's a lot of difficulties that come with also like working in the African market and stuff, for example. So it'd be interesting if you could shed light on what are the other challenges that you face in terms of doing business in South Africa in a sports space, which everywhere in the world is a difficult industry to work in.
Yeah, how do I answer without giving away too much? I think, like you said, it's the same problems as everywhere else in the world, and it's going to come down to relationships. And I almost at times I think would I have been better off just studying psychology, because at the end of the day you're just dealing with people, and essentially you're in recruitment, and if you have some sort of industrial psychology experience, or essentially just know how to win people over, that's going to go a very long way. So look, I think there's challenges like everywhere else. At the end of the day, the clubs have all the power, and it's just about breaking those barriers down and building relationships. And I'm still early in this game. There's a long way to go. Hopefully, over the coming months and years, those relationships can just get stronger, and they trust us enough to work with us.
100%. I think before we jumped on, I said to Sol, I think one of the biggest things that is so important in the sports industry is relationships and the trust, right? And you've just touched upon it there. You've made the exact point that I was trying to say beforehand. And so just to finish off, my final one from me really is, how are you going about building those relationships, and how are you building that trust? I know it might be a good time to touch upon like the events you're organising, for example. How is it that you're making sure you're associating with the right people and building these relationships into something that's going to benefit your business and Jozi Talent?
Yeah, I think what's really important is firstly just to be very professional. And I think being FIFA licensed, having some sort of legal experience, and also just, I guess, a good reputation in the industry here goes a long way. First impressions really do speak volumes. So I think the next step then is using all possible avenues to get the right contacts. And I'm a big fan of LinkedIn. Usually LinkedIn would be a great one, but it's not really that common that a lot of the clubs here locally would be active on LinkedIn. So luckily we've all played football in South Africa and been involved in it for many years now. So just chasing, as Rassie Erasmus would say, chasing lost causes, trying to hound people for contacts, and just not taking no for an answer. And once we do establish contact with someone, just trying to be, I guess, quite scientific with building that relationship by just keeping on top of it and trying to take every single opportunity that comes our way to engage that network and, I guess, get our kind of message across, and essentially just hear what their needs are so that we can try and fulfill those needs.
Fantastic.
Amazing. Yeah, so interesting. And also love the Rassie Erasmus quote, just to tie back to the rugby, which is so good. Yeah, so good, mate. And I'm sure Jamie's sent you the final question, but I'm sure this will be a great answer, especially like looking through all your journey and what you've spoken about there. So if you were to go back to a time, maybe when you were working at Nike, or maybe when it was, when you were just coming up for the idea of the agency, tell us one thing that you do the same, one thing you do differently, and one thing you tell yourself to motivate yourself.
So I think in terms of keeping things the same, I'd say pretty much everything, because it has led me to here. So yeah, I don't really want to take the past for granted. I would probably change the mindset a little bit. I think, the kind of German perfectionist in me, because I've got German heritage, is that, and I think a lot of young entrepreneurs would be very guilty of, when starting a business, focusing very much on the supply side of the business, getting a great website, building the business plan, and all of that kind of back-end stuff, and neglecting the demand side. And that's been something that I've learned in a big way, is just test the market as much as possible and really get to know how to sell, because you have to sell yourself in anything you do, but especially as a business owner, and learning to hear no all the time, and maybe like you have one or two glimpses of yeses. And then I think in terms of motivation, like I've always been, not always, but I think since studying, I've been quite disciplined at it, because I just like accepted this is what I have to do in order to get through to it. But then beyond that, it also goes like hand in hand, is just accepting that like this is what hard feels like. You have to suffer and endure to achieve anything decent. And like your CV is basically just an accumulation of your toughest triumphs in life. So yeah, just accepting and almost like basking in the suffering, like that's I guess a big thing in like philosophy, is just accept it and just know, okay, it wasn't going to be easy being an entrepreneur, being a sports agent, whatnot, studying law. So just accept that it is tough, and that's what it feels like, and it's only going to get better from there.
Love it.
So good, so good. When you talk about basking in the suffering, that's the real German South African 50 split coming out in there. I can see that. For
Peter
sure. Such a good way to end. But I love that as an insight. It's so good. But yeah, mate, like so many amazing takeaways from that, and just like finishing off there with you talking about the CV and just it being a collection of your sufferings, I think it's so good. So thank you so much for coming on, and I think Jamie will also echo with saying that you're very modest and very kind of like you play down some of your achievements, but some of the things you're doing and some of the names you're mentioning are just like really amazing. So very happy to see you doing so well, and I'm sure our listeners will love to check out your journey and take a lot of inspiration from you going and setting up your own thing. So thanks very much for your time, mate, and looking forward to following along in the next few years.
Thanks a lot, guys, and yeah, it's also awesome what you guys are doing here. Jamie and I are in touch quite frequently, and obviously try to stick close to you guys. So yeah, really appreciate it, and we'll just echo back everything that you said to me, and yeah, the praises, I can just sing them your way too.
It was a really good conversation, really good insight from someone who's worked in one of the biggest companies in the world, but has decided to leave that and go and do something by himself. So there's plenty of good takeaways in there. I'm happy to shoot off the first one, which I think struck me so early on, is the fact that he's shot off 25 applications just to get that first foot in the door. And I think that's such a sign where like some people will go around complaining about like opportunities aren't being handed to them. They can't seem to fall into place at something where they really want. And actually listen to him. He applied 25 times to different roles at one company just to try and get their attention. And it worked, and maybe that's the sacrifice that's needed sometimes, particularly to work at such a big one. So yeah, I think fair play to him. That shows the commitment to just getting your foot in the door that's needed.
100%, and I'm sure people listening to this will be comparing that to some of their grad applications, but to go 25 times at one place, get recognised for going 25 times, and then go through a recruiter that is a personal contact you've made is some like tenacity. So it's pretty impressive that he did that alongside all other applications. So yeah. Couldn't agree with that more. The second one that I want to chuck in is I really like one thing that really stuck with me is when he said he wished he had studied psychology. And my overall takeaway from what he put there is Like, I think, and I'm learning this, Jamie, you're definitely a big advocate of this, is that the amount of like business and the working world is about people skills. And he's so clear on the fact that his people skills have got him to such a good place. And I think it's such a good takeaway for anyone listening, that you can have all the hard work and the tenacity in the world, but if you don't understand fundamentally how people work and how to sell to people, you're not going to have that much success in any job, whether it's corporate or entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Well, 100%, and actually kind of ties into my third point that you've mentioned there, that those skills are so important. It's the psychology side. But my final point was that you have to learn those skills at some point, and what he did, and we often talk with people who have had experience in the corporate world, etc. beforehand, before moving and maybe doing something else that we consider a more path less chosen. But for him, he spoke so fondly about the stuff that he learned during that time, and he even admitted that there was periods of time where, maybe he's being a little bit selfish, but he was playing the long game, that he knew the longer he stayed in an organisation like that, the more he would pick up on the skills they've adopted, the mindsets they've adopted, and ultimately the success that they have, right? And so he was learning those skills that you've just mentioned there by being a part of a company like that. So my final takeaway would be, just put yourself in a position, play the long game, even if it is slightly selfish, and build up those skills in somewhere where you're going to learn them.
Couldn't agree more. And I think a big takeaway from your journey, Jamie, is doing just that. So love that. So to sum up those three, we've got tenacity first, we've got people skills second, and we've got finding a place where you can accumulate those skills and learn from people. Yeah, really great episode. Thank you very much for getting him on, Jamie, and amazing that he was an accidental housemate of one of our previous guests' dads without even knowing. Love that. I think we're firmly ticking off the South African population one by one to interview, and I'm sure there's more coming soon as well. But yeah, thanks very much for your time, and we'll catch you next week.
Okay, brilliant. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Tristan. We just want to ask one final thing, if you've managed to get this far in the episode. If you could just go onto our social media platforms, particularly onto our Instagram and LinkedIn, and just drop us a follow. That gives us a really easy platform to be able to advertise our latest podcast to you, and you'll be able to see all our updates on there. Thank you.